This story begins in the Empire of Lorraine, specifically the White Palace, which was famous for its wealth. A beautiful girl with bright blonde hair. One lady swung and struck with a whip. She even got scratches on her face. The girl called her all sorts of swear words and told her to shut up already. The girl even fell to the floor because of the strong blow. She was in incredible pain, but she had no idea how much longer she was going to have to put up with all this. Then a man also joined in the beating of the poor woman. He said he was Aaron, the only prince of the empire. The man looked incredibly angry and asked how dare she interfere with his nightly entertainment just because she was his sister. It didn't give her that right. He swung around to hit her again and said he would teach her another lesson, for her to remember for sure. And at that moment, the girl's back received another very strong blow. She did not scream or cry. She kept all her pain inside herself, in order not to show weakness. Aaron screamed even harder, and said that they, women, were only a tool for the continuation of the species, and were capable of nothing more. He also added that they are absolutely nothing without their man, so it was high time she remembered that. He swung again to strike at poor Mrs. Ava. At that moment the door opened and the girl's face appeared. When she saw that Aaron was going to hit her again, she closed the door with shaking hands. She apologized very quietly to Mrs. Ava, saying it was all her fault. The girl herself lay on the floor and tolerated all of this. But she was very annoyed because she was also a princess of the empire. But she had to endure all this humiliation. All the people in the palace did not even treat her as a human being, just because she was a woman. But the girl didn't understand why things were the way they were. But this whole horrible situation had started a few days ago. The girl who was peeking behind the door was walking down the corridors with a candle to go to her room. But as she passed one of the doors, she suddenly saw that the light was still on and heard some noise. This interested her at once. Looking inside, she saw Mrs. Eva doing something near the table. This surprised her very much. She went inside and, turning to the lady, asked what she was doing at such a late hour. She turned around and saw Moran at once. She explained to her that she was washing her dress because her brother Aaron had poured tea on her at dinner. At that moment, I remembered how he had done it without a single regret or hesitation, just taking the hot tea and pouring it right on her head. So the girl took it in her hands when she had washed it, and showing it to Marin, said that it was now very clean and quite as good as new. But seeing the look on Marin's face, she was surprised and asked what was wrong. Since she looked completely unimportant, the girl was silent for a while, and then, taking a closer look, asked if her brother had done something to her. Marin began to feel very anxious about this. Her hands began to shake violently, and she turned to Mistress, saying that this time Mr. Aaron had ordered her to keep him company. When Ava heard this, she was incredibly surprised. She couldn't believe it was even possible. But most of all, the girl resented this situation because of the fact that Marine has a fiancé in a neighboring country, and they were about to get married. In fact, in this country, people look down on you and despise you just for being a woman. And because of this, Ava has the impression that this is the way it is everywhere, and it should be. It is quite normal. That's why she wants Marin, who spent her childhood, to leave this country and live happily away from this horrible place. Of course, Eva supported the girl and hugged her goodbye, but she didn't know what she could do to prevent these events from happening. But she knew for sure that she had to help her. When evening came, Ava went to her brother's study to mop the floors as he had ordered, and he sat in his beautiful and expensive chair, watching the girl's work, and he wanted to do something to hurt her. So the man started wiping his boot on poor Ava's back, saying that as luck would have it, the hunt was rainy, and his boots were getting very dirty because of it. The girl didn't react to it in any way, and he in turn asked that she polish them, since that was all she was even capable of doing. He looked with contempt at his sister, and also said that he would not allow her to rest until she had finished all the things he had ordered to be done. After a while of silence, he looked at his watch and said in an irritated voice that if anything, Marin wasn't here yet, and it was already time. Aaron was incredibly angry, and said that if she was even a second late, he would strip her down and leave her outside naked in the heavy rain, to let her know not to be late for him under any circumstances. When Ava heard this, she realized that she had to do something about it. So she turned to her brother in a quiet voice and told him that Marin was feeling very ill and would not be able to come to see him that day. She didn't even turn around to look at Aaron. also said that she ordered her to take a break and sent her back in order to prevent her from getting even more sick. When the man heard this, he was simply furious. He started yelling at his sister, asking how this could be understood. He asked how she even dared to ruin his fun. He didn't care what form she had to come to him and do what he asked. In fact, he was glad it had worked out this way. He had another excuse to make fun of his sister. So he took a whip in his hand and started beating and saying all those horrible things, and Eve just tolerated it all. At this point, when he had already beaten her enough that her entire back was bloody and gnawed back, he stepped closer to her and grabbed her by the hair and pulled her head up. Aaron said that he heard that she was still innocent. So with a smile on his face and a greedy look, he said that she couldn't even do one simple thing, like, for a girl, is just spread her legs. Eva didn't say anything to that. She just stared at him, and she didn't even have the energy to get really angry. Her gaze was emotionless and emotionless. Aaron continued to call her names, calling her a worthless princess as well as a pathetic piece of junk. After that, he strongly Mudar put her head back to the ground. Because of that, the girl couldn't stand it and started screaming because it was really very painful. However, at this moment something strange happened. She suddenly started remembering some moments and didn't understand what was happening to her memory. The girl had flashbacks in front of her eyes when she was completely different, whether she had dark short hair or not, and worked in some office. When Eva got to the principal's office, she bowed and apologized. But he was so incredibly over the top that he even took all the papers off his desk. In an angry voice, he said that he knew perfectly well that she would make a mistake somewhere anyway. He came closer and closer to her, and with those steps he raised his voice, telling her never again to dare go against his orders, thinking he knew better. He was already too close, and Eve could feel his breath on her ear. The man lowered his voice and said he might change his mind if she entertained him with her body. He grabbed her ass with a greedy grip and told her he would gladly let her go back to work, as long as she met his needs. But Eva didn't put up with all this. She ran away at once so that nothing bad would happen. After that hard day, the girl returned to her home, and there she was met by her angry brother. She didn't even have time to say that she had already returned, but he immediately ran up to her. The man didn't even say hello. He immediately punched her in the face and grabbed her by the hair and started yelling at her. The guy said that a friend of his was coming over very soon, and he asked her to make them dinner. He also asked her if she remembered. Eva didn't have time to respond to that, because he kept yelling, saying she couldn't even do that, and continued calling her names. Then he hit her head on the floor, so that she had blood all over her face. Eva at that moment did not understand why she should cook for his friend, just because she was a woman. She is more like a housekeeper or a slave. She had already been working very hard all this time, and fatigue eventually took its toll on her. Eva was soon taken away by ambulance, and she remembers it all. Right now, as the girl lies on the floor, all mangled, she remembers that in a past life her boss and brother had driven her so hard that she ended up dying from exhaustion and the injuries inflicted. Now the girl understood perfectly well that if she did not resist, she might die in this life as she had then. For some time, Eva just sat on the floor. Her brother had stopped beating her. He stepped aside and asked her why she was lying there. He continued to call her names and swung for another punch, saying that she was stupid on top of everything else. All her past life, girls had been told that she should never defy anyone and be patient. She should never have an opinion of her own. And now Eve was well aware that this was the wrong opinion. The girl took all her strength in her fist and turned around to her brother, who, when he saw this, was very surprised. She got to her feet and walked over to Aaron. But after thinking that this time was sure to be different, she wouldn't allow any more of this behavior, especially when she found out that it had been exactly the same that time. So the girl said in a confident voice that she did not agree with his opinion at all, for it was wrong. When Aaron heard this, he was confused, for his sister had never gone against him and had always behaved properly. The girl stood steady on her feet, and even her voice did not tremble. She told her brother that he was wrong. The man, drawing his whip for another blow, asked what she was talking about. Eve lifted her head up and said that they, women, are not procreative instruments at all. They are human beings like him, like all other men. Girls are just as entitled as men to have an opinion, to do what they want and not to do what they don't want. Aaron was furious when he heard this. He laughed and asked if she really thought he and she were the same. He threw his whip aside and asked what kind of nonsense she was even saying and started calling her a woman of easy virtue. He ran closer to the girl and already swung his fist at her, telling her he was about to teach her a lesson so she wouldn't even think of saying such words again. In fact, up to this point, Eve could only tolerate the pain that had been inflicted on her, both in her past and in this life. However, now that she saw her brother about to hit her, she was able to fend off his blow so that he even lost his coordination and fell to the floor. She looked at him with utter contempt and asked if he really resorted to violence now, even though without women he wouldn't be in this world at all. Aaron was confused and just stared at the girl in surprise, and she asked that he keep that important thought in mind. He was about to answer her something in order to insult her again, but he didn't have time because Maren, who had been watching the situation the whole time, walked into the room. The girl turned to Ava in surprise, but suddenly another voice came from behind her. A man. He also came into the room and apologized to the girl for distracting her. The man turned to Master Aaron, who was already on his feet and about to strike back for his sister. The boy looked up in surprise at the open door and saw a black-haired, handsome man in uniform. He introduced himself, saying his name was Noah Stewart. The man opened the doors fully, and another guard appeared behind him. Noah apologized for disturbing him at this late hour, but said the Emperor wanted to see him. Aaron, when he saw the man, immediately began to panic greatly. He said in a trembling voice that since his father was calling, he had no choice but to obey. But before he left, he pointed his finger at Eve, saying that he would save her upbringing for another time. Then he turned to Noah and said that it was time for them to go. The man was very much afraid of his father, so he ran straight to meet him, for it was impossible to make him angry. But he glanced at the girl before he left. Eve was covered in blood and very much at a loss as to what was even going on and what she should do next. Then the man turned to his guard and told him to stay and take care of Eve. He was a little surprised, but said he would do it. Then Noah and Aaron went straight to the Emperor to meet him. Ava had no strength left at that moment. She fell to the ground right on her knees and still couldn't believe that she had actually managed to do it. The girl's whole body trembled, and she thought about the fact that she had made it and not lost to her brother in this terrible argument and fight. At that moment, Marina ran into the room and immediately ran to Mrs. Eva in a worried voice asking if she was all right. But when the girl got too close, she saw the blood on her face and said that it must be very serious. But Ava just smiled and replied that she was fine. However, Maren helped her up and told her that they should heal this sooner rather than later, otherwise it would leave a very unsightly scar, or it could even get an infection in the open wound. But at that moment the knight who had been left to take care of Eve said that if he stayed, it would be deserved. Because this wouldn't have happened if she hadn't insisted on crossing the crown prince. The girls looked at him in surprise. But I made him feel very strongly, and said that he apparently knew what he was talking about. But then I also said that I was the princess of this country. And he is only a private knight, and he has no right to insult her. When the man heard this, he was very surprised. He was even confused for a while. But after that, the knight bowed before the lady and apologized for his behavior. Eve, who was still sitting on the floor, said she had had enough and he could leave. When Maren heard this, she was very surprised. She wanted to say something to Mistress, but she went on and said that she didn't want to obey them anymore. And the girl thinks it's completely wrong that a woman can't act on her own free will. She wants to fight for her freedom as a member of the royal family. The next morning, Eva had a lot of work to do, and she was walking down the street, which was very warm, carrying a bag of dirty clothes in her hands. In fact, the girl couldn't even believe that he had given her dirty laundry last night to get revenge, and that was just disgusting. But of course no one was going to stand up for her, because laundry is a woman's job, according to all the men and not just men and women who were forced to do it. And she's just some worthless princess. Eve didn't know how to make them realize that her abilities weren't affected by the fact that she was a woman. But then, as she passed another column, she suddenly heard some noise. She looked to the side and saw many people, not realizing what all the commotion was about. When Eve got closer, she saw that all these people were knights, but in turn, stood before them all with weapons, and told them to attack him and not to be shy. One of the knights went straight to attack the lord, and they had a duel. The other knights who stood around watched it all and supported the lord. Eve, when she saw all this, realized that they were sparring. The other knights watched admiringly and said that he was incredibly skilled at what he did. Noah, for his part, was completely immersed in the bout and actually looked pretty even. And at that moment I remembered that their empire was entirely a military state, and the stronger a man was, the more respected he was in society. And if you distinguished yourself on the battlefield, you're more likely to be recognized even by the upper class, who are very selective about people. The girl was a kendo fighter in her past life, and she can use that to her advantage right now. So Eva headed back to the manor, all excited at the thought of arranging with her father to send her to the battlefield, where she could prove to everyone that women were capable of more than just washing and cooking. At this time in the manor, the emperor was talking to a man who was standing near the door. The emperor was wary and asked Simon to just get out of the way, but the man insisted that he was not going to do that. He told His Majesty that the Empress had not yet recovered from the raids she had received the other day. So he begged pardon, but could by no means let him in there. But the emperor lifted his head up and said in a cold voice that he wouldn't work so hard this day, so everything would go smoothly. He shoved Simon, asking him to get out of the way already. The man kept blocking his way, however, to protect his mistress. At that moment, their argument was interrupted by the voice of Eva, who came running straight there. She turned to her father, saying that she needed to speak to him urgently. The emperor looked angrily at his daughter and said that now was not the time, and asked that she not even come near him. The girl was confused for a while. She did not know how to act. Before, if her father had said those words to her, she would have just left as he had asked. But now she remained standing still, and said she insisted on her request. Eva said she really needed him to listen to her carefully, and so, as she said these words, she began to move closer to him. The man asked in a cold voice if she was trying to steal his precious time, which was already too short. He pointed his finger at her and asked if she really wanted to die right here and now, because otherwise she wouldn't do something so stupid. Eva was a little scared, but her voice didn't shake. She said that if he was going to kill her, he could at least let her choose where she died. The emperor looked at the girl in surprise, not understanding what she was even saying, and asked about it. Eva then raised her voice and asked that he send her straight to the battlefield. She was very sure of herself and her request. She said it so loudly that even the woman who sat in the room with her bandaged hand heard it too. The emperor was silent for a while, not knowing what to say to this. But then he told her to stop, because apparently she had gone mad and didn't even know what she was talking about. He went somewhere to the side and said that if she planned to die, let her do what she wanted. Then he turned to Simon and said he was leaving the rest up to him. The man, who was used to hard work by now, said he would do everything as the man ordered. Then the emperor went on about his business, very angry about not being able to do what he wanted to do. And the girl who sat in the room thought of Eve with a very sad expression on her face. Simon turned to Eve and said that she had 3 months. He would have her sent to the battlefield by then, and in that time she must also finish all her business. The girl was very surprised, and then she asked what he was talking about in general, for she really didn't understand. Simon in turn looked at her with disdain, and said that she was going to die after all, so she should finish whatever she wanted to do. Eva immediately began to deny it, but the man then asked why she had agreed to such a proposal. The two of them were silent for a while, but then the man bowed and said that she didn't have to worry. On the battlefield, the life of a little girl like her would be cut short in an instant, so she might not even be hurt. After that, he turned around and walked away. Eva was actually surprised by this behavior of the man because he was ruthless. This man was the Reich Chancellor and her father's right-hand man, as well as a very sarcastic man who spared no one. However, the girl does not intend to just die on the battlefield. She's going to fight to the end, and at this moment she remembered her past life. One day Eva was sitting on the floor packing her bag when her brother came in. She asked him in surprise if the national finals were already tomorrow. She only nodded back at him, and he then said with all the anger he could muster that she was downright worthless, and started calling her every bad word he knew. As a result, the girl was excluded from the national tournament and could not go there. She did not understand why he was reacting so keenly to the whole situation. But at that moment, her brother stepped closer to her and grabbed her by the shirt and asked if she really wanted to humiliate him so badly that she would go there. He also said she could warn everyone that she got injured, or just sick. If she is such a worthless, incapable person, she should just quit the sport and not embarrass everyone else. In the end, the girl succumbed to her brother's threats after all. However, in her previous life, she was very close to winning even the national championship in this sport. Of course, Eva doesn't think kendo is common in the world she's reborn in, but if she remembers all her skills, she'll surely become stronger. And maybe some of the techniques of wielding that stick overlap with those of wielding a sword. So she can't hesitate and needs to start her training right away. The girl didn't run right away and went about her business to get things done right. At this very time, Noah and his assistant had already finished sparring and were sitting in his office, swamped with a very large amount of paperwork. Noah casually jerked his hand, and all the papers that had been standing to his left sprinkled to the floor. His assistant immediately began collecting them, and the man apologized to Jaden, putting them in his quill. He also began gathering those papers back onto the table. He said he made him help him like that. Now he's got him doing all this horrible paperwork that's more exhausting than swinging a sword. But Jaden smiled and said that he knew he was tired of working for the Master of Hell, so he needed to get some rest and unload himself. Noah immediately got very serious and said that unfortunately he couldn't do it, because without him the whole economy would just collapse. Jaden got to his feet and wondered why he, a simple knight and aide, was taking on so much responsibility, because it was completely wrong. He just couldn't take it sooner or later. Noah was silent for a while, pondering his answer. Then he said that he would do whatever his master ordered. Yeah, the guy kept objecting. He asked what he was doing while the man was doing all this work. Maybe he spends his life having fun, not even thinking about the master. Jaden said that he thought it was totally unfair to do that while Aaron was out having fun with the girls and Noah had to work like crazy. The man turned around and said nothing more. Then Noah turned to him and said that he knew he was concerned about him, and he was pleased. But he was about to say that all these speeches were completely useless, when suddenly Eva came running into the room. When she turned to Noah's steward and said she wanted to ask him for something, the man looked at her in surprise, not realizing what was going on. Then he stepped closer to him and asked what she was doing here. Jaden turned around and said he was going back to his post. When the man left the room, Noah returned to his question and asked the girl what she needed. Eva asked in a delighted voice that he teach her how to fence. When the man heard this, he was very surprised, and for a while he just stared at her in silence, not realizing if she really meant it. Then he turned around and apologized, saying that he could not fulfill her request, and added that he was busy. So he asked Eva to leave as soon as possible and not to distract him. But Eva retorted that she didn't. At least she wants him to listen to her, not jump to conclusions. Noah wouldn't listen to her, however. He went back to his desk and began his paperwork again. The girl, when she saw his cold reaction, was very surprised. She realized that she couldn't do anything about it, because he didn't even change his face. So she came closer to him. At this moment, the man, scrutinizing the paper he held in his hands, only sighed heavily. Eve, peering out from behind her shoulder, read the title. There was a harvest report, and carefully, too, she began to study its contents. It said that the grapes had gone bad. Then an idea popped into her head, and she wondered if they could use it for wine in that case. Noah was a little surprised that she still hadn't left, for he had been so deeply immersed in his work that he hadn't even noticed her presence. The girl, seeing the expression on her face, immediately became embarrassed. She realized that she had said it casually out loud, not just thought it. He said the grapes are frozen cold wave for wine, and wondered if it could really be done. Eva calmed down a little, for he reacted calmly. So she said it was possible if you crushed them while the grapes were frozen. She was actually surprised that Noah was listening to her opinion. In fact, such a problem with grapes had happened often in her past life. But the process of making wine is also unknown in this world so far, which is why he was very surprised when he heard about it. Noah, seeing her surprised face, said that actually normally they would have discarded such an idea, but considering the huge losses, they should try it, since there was nothing left to lose. Eve immediately got excited and said that it was all accurate, but above all, it would help all the other people. The man was very surprised. After all, he had never heard the girl laugh at all before. He got up from the table and thought about the fact that she had come up with such a brilliant idea when she just looked at the documents and read their contents. Noah pondered for a while what to do next. Then he turned to Mrs. Eve, reminding her that she had said she wanted to learn fencing. Then he said that if the girl could deal with these and other documents, he would have time to teach her swordsmanship, saying that he even bowed to her. Eva was very surprised to hear this suggestion, but assumed that he probably wanted to see how she would handle those responsibilities. But when she looked at the desk, she saw stacks of papers to study and problems to solve. It scared her a little, but she really wanted to learn swordsmanship and go to the battlefield, so she told herself she could do it and got right to work. Hours passed, and she continued to study the papers, signing them in some places and jotting down ideas in others. When evening came, she finally finished. Completely exhausted, she lay down on the couch that stood in the study. The girl yawned, and as she lay there, she told herself that she couldn't even look at them anymore. Noah, who had gone off to do other things in the meantime, came back and looked at the sorted-out papers. He was surprised at the stacks, that the girl had done it all so quickly. But he went through some papers, and after reading her ideas, he realized that it was just perfect. She had handled everything perfectly. Then the man shifted his gaze to the couch where Ava was sleeping peacefully, very tired after doing this job. He stood and watched for a while, then took a blanket and covered the girl to keep her warm. Many hours had passed since then, and finally morning came. Eve woke up to the sun shining in her eyes and the loud singing of birds outside her window. Looking around, she realized she was not in her bedroom and assumed she had fallen asleep last night due to extreme fatigue in the study. At that moment, Noah came in to see that she was already awake and wished her a good morning. He had more papers in his hands to go through, papers to sign and problems to solve. Eva was incredibly surprised when she saw this, and he looked very serious when he said he was looking forward to their work that day. The girl then, frightened, asked in a trembling voice if she hadn't finished all that work last night. She got out of bed and walked closer to him and asked him what about their training when they would be doing it. Noah replied that she should do whatever she could to free up his time. After that, he turned around and started to leave, saying that he would accompany Master Aaron from now on, and so he was leaving her alone. The girl sat back down on the couch, not understanding how this could even have happened, and assumed even that they had chosen a human to train. In fact, she was only 3 months away from being sent to the battlefield, and she needed to be prepared in order to ensure that she wouldn't just be killed there. But at that moment she saw a piece of paper blown from the table by the wind, and when she came closer to it and took it in her hands, she was very surprised. When she read the name, she realized that it was just her brother's accounts. When she looked at the numbers, she was surprised, because it was an incredibly large amount of money, and Eva didn't understand where it had come from. Without a moment's thought, Eva immediately set about doing her work, to finish at least a little early that day, and as the sun began to set over the horizon, she finally signed the last paper, scrutinizing it carefully. She exhaled with relief when she finished doing her work and set the papers aside, but still she was very much disturbed by the paper she had seen that morning. She was struck by her brother's extravagance. He allowed himself various girls, luxury goods, and gambling. However, it was possible to feed as many as 500 soldiers a month on such sums. His went to the window and watched the sun set over the horizon, wondering if his father even knew where his son was spending all that money. But at that moment she was distracted by Noah's voice, which came to her and addressed her. She turned and immediately asked if he was done with her brother. Moving closer to the desk, she said that she had done all the paperwork he had been asked to do. The man at that moment took one of the documents and began to scrutinize its contents. After reading everything carefully, he knelt down in front of Mrs. Eve and asked for her forgiveness. Closing his eyes and lowering his head, he said that in fact the papers he had given her that day were meant to fulfill for the whole of the next week. When Eva heard that, she asked how that was even possible. Noah said that partly he thought that if he made her do so much work, she might even lose interest in fencing, but above all, he wanted to see if she could help him. So he went to such extreme lengths to load her with so much paperwork. When the girl heard this, she was even pleased. She said that it was clear now, and it meant that he had deliberately made her handle so much paperwork to assess her ability and seriousness about fencing. Noah said that everything is absolutely correct, and he can tell that she is very serious. And he also learned that her paperwork skills are beyond anything he could have ever seen. Eva heard these words and was very happy, and even blushed a little, because she had never been complimented before. The man, in turn, added that he agreed to teach her fencing, as he had promised. She held out her hand to help him up, and with a smile on her face, she thanked him for it. In fact, Eva was really excited, for this was the first time her abilities had been recognized, especially by a man. Besides, the girl was excited about their fencing lessons. Soon after that, they went out to the special training field. Eva wore a special uniform to make her comfortable, but unfortunately, of course, women did not wear pants at that time, so she had to work out in a skirt. She stood opposite Noah, and the two began to have a duel. Before long, the girl had taken a few steps and punches, enough for a professional, and the man was in a tight spot. But since he was a very professional fighter, he was immediately able to get out of the situation, and even knocked the sword out of the girl's hands. When Eve looked back, she saw her sword flying several meters away, and she was very surprised. She didn't even notice how it had happened, because it was so fast. Noah looked at the girl admiringly and said that he was actually even surprised, because there was some foundation behind these moves, and maybe things would get easier than he thought. He handed the girl a sword and told her that her style was different from what was generally recognized, and asked where she had studied swordsmanship. Eve drew her sword and laughed nervously and said no, she was just trying to reproduce information from one book. Of course, the girl couldn't say that she had practiced kendo in her past life. That was why the swordsmanship style was not like their usual one. Noah, hearing her, said that in that case he wanted to spar with her again, but only all ready to act serious without giving in and to be focused. Eva was excited about practicing. Indeed, she wanted to do just as he said, for it inspired her. After that, they began their duel. The girl was very focused on not missing a single blow and, if she did, fending them off. In fact, Noah never ceased to marvel at the girl, for with her skills, Eva herself could achieve many heights. Her swordsmanship, her data skills are total superiority over Master Eren in everything. They continued their duel while the knights watched intently and were amazed at how well the girl could stand up to Noah. But at that moment, there was another voice. It was Eren. He saw all this and asked what was going on. Then the man began to walk closer to the battlefield, past the knights who worshipped him, and when he saw his sister there, he froze on the spot. Eren was very surprised at how well she wielded the sword, and was surprised she could do it at all. Then he stepped closer and turned to his sister quite contemptuously, asking what that hideous outfit was on her. He folded his arms at his sides and said he could see that she still lacked discipline. So I guess he would have to teach her another lesson. When the girl looked back, she was very surprised to see her brother. He asked her to come over to him. The girl was very annoyed that even here he had managed to stick his nose in and interrupt her training. Just as she was about to approach Eren, Noah blocked her way and turned to the man, saying that Eve was practicing sword-wielding right now, so he asked that he not interrupt them. When Eren heard this, he was very surprised. He said that a woman didn't actually need a sword, and Noah was his knight first and foremost, by the way, and he had no right to do that on his own time. But the man replied that gender was irrelevant in this matter. Lady Eva is worthy of her sword, and she shows her skills perfectly on the battlefield. He also said that it was all the more in his interest as well, because developing her skills would help Mr. Eren as well. When his brother heard this, he only hummed, and then said that even if a woman had such talents, she was still just a treasure in a box. Noah didn't back down and said that since he felt that way, it was his role to polish this very treasure. He also said that he would take care of her, so he didn't have to worry about it at all. Eren shifted his gaze to the sharp sword at this point and just stood there silent for a while. Noah, in turn, turned to the knights who were standing nearby and said that this place could be dangerous, so he asked that they escort Master Eren to safety. The men bowed immediately and were about to carry out the order, but then Eren said that no one cared at all. He couldn't waste any more of his precious time on people like Eve. He turned and started to walk away, then in various curses at his sister. It annoyed him that she'd taken to hunting her down like that, Noah. So he wasn't going to forgive and leave it all to her like that. In turn, Noah turned back to the girl and apologized for interrupting the training session. Then he said that since it was all over, they could continue. Ava was very surprised at this behavior of the man and thanked him for it. But he said it was not worth thanking, for he had done what he had to do. The girl was actually quite surprised, but in a pleasant way, that he didn't judge her by her gender. And even though they are both men, Noah is still quite different from her brother. Several more hours passed from that moment, and finally their training was over. Eve walked through the manor, returning to her room. She was incredibly tired, but even though the pain in her legs was intense, it was a comfortable pain. The girl walked on, unsuspecting, and didn't even notice that her brother appeared behind her. At that moment, Aaron suddenly ran up to her and grabbed her by the hair, pulling her to him. Eve turned around and was surprised to see him. She even dropped her sword in surprise. The guy was pulling her away from him, telling her to follow him. Eve started screaming, asking what he was doing and begging him to let her go, but he told her to stop whining. Soon they were out in the backyard of the manor, and the girl saw that they were approaching an abandoned well. When she saw it, she even stopped. She couldn't believe that it was really happening, because she realized that it wouldn't end well. At that point, he punched her in the stomach and threw her head down over the well. He held her like that for a while. Then he whispered some insult in her ear and threw her straight down. Ava flew a few meters down and landed straight into the icy water. Then she heard her brother laughing from above. He looked at her wet and dirty face, asking if she thought this place was perfect for her. He said in a cheery voice that this was her reward for getting carried away and getting into other people's business. And then with irritation, Aaron asked, "Does she really consider herself a jewel? Then in that case, she should reconsider her place in their home." Eve looked at him and realized that she had let her guard down. She realized that it would be very hard to find her in this place, because people rarely passed by. She was left all alone at the bottom of a deep well, and it was already beginning to get dark outside. The girl did not know what to do now. At this time, Noah had already returned to his chambers and was getting dressed and ready for bed, when suddenly a knight came in and told him about the lost sword. The man looked at him in surprise. Then the knight handed over the weapon, saying that it had been found in the south corridor. Noah examined the sword carefully, and said that indeed he had just lent it to Eve. But he realized that the girl wasn't the kind of person who would be so careless with a weapon, and he assumed that something had probably happened to her, since she'd just left it in the middle of the hallway. Then he decided to check it out right away. The man took a flashlight and went to look for it. He walked around the estate for a while and found nothing. Soon afterward, Noah went outside and heard some strange sounds coming from nearby. He turned the corner and saw a well, and then the sounds became even louder. The man immediately ran there and whistled downstairs and shouted, asking if anyone was there. Eve, for her part, stood in the cold water and screamed for someone to help her. When she saw the light, she even had hope of rescue. Noah, hearing the girl's voice, immediately turned to her. He asked her to wait a little longer, for he was sure to help her. Then the man grabbed the rope used to draw buckets of water and climbed down. He picked up the girl and started climbing back down. It cost him a lot of effort, but it went smoothly, and when Eva was outside, he looked at her and said it was all right. She was safe now, and she was in no danger. The girl was all wet, and in a trembling voice she looked up at him and thanked him for finding her. But after that, her eyes began to hurt very badly, and she ended up closing them. The man got very worried. He started to wake her up, but she wouldn't wake up. Noah didn't know how long she'd even been there. It's an abandoned well, after all. Someone had taken her to such a remote place so that no one would find her. But at that moment he looked somewhere to the side and saw something shiny. When he picked it up, he saw a brooch. It was very precious and bright. The man recognized it immediately, for it belonged to Aaron, and he understood who had done it. But he didn't understand how he could do that to his only sister. Noah took the girl in his arms and began to carry her back to the manor to keep her warm. He realized that there was no excuse for this act, and that it had been done on purpose to hurt his sister. The next morning, when Eva woke up in her room, she realized that Noah had brought her back when she passed out. Later, she was told about it by Maureen. That face she saw before she passed out could only be that of someone who genuinely cared and worried about the girl. In the afternoon, When the girl had regained her strength and had breakfast, she went to practice. When she was practicing her skills, a knight suddenly came up to her and said that it was an unusual swordsmanship technique and asked if she wanted to spar with him. Eva, of course, was excited about this opportunity and agreed. However, at the end of the fight, she could not defeat him and even fell to the ground. The man arrogantly asked, "Did she really decide to play a brave knight? And since she is really here, they will definitely teach her how to use a real sword." Eva sat on the floor for a while longer, thinking about how she expected the dress to be very impractical in this case, but she had no choice. In the end, she agreed to go ahead with the bouts. The next time, however, the man again knocked the sword out of her hands and pointed it straight at her throat. The girl was scared out of her wits and said she was giving up. Eva also asked him to put it away. At that moment, Noah came up to them and told them to stop. He turned to the girl and asked if she could help him with the papers. The girl, of course, agreed, for she could not refuse him. So she returned and took her sword and put it in a special sheath. Then she heard the other knights talking. One of them said that in the end a woman could never beat a man. His partner agreed and said that the princess was certainly trying hard, but obviously it was not enough. The knights doubted whether she would be of any use to them at all on the battlefield, where things would be many times tougher and more dangerous. Eva went to the manor, thinking that of course they were right. If she went to the front like that, she would be a liability and of no use to the army. At this stage of development, she lacked physical strength and skill. She mentally thanked the warriors for reminding her to try harder. So Eva wasn't going to stay where she was. She went back to the manor and quickly sorted through all the papers Noah had left for her. Soon after, the girl went to the sewing room and made herself some training pants there, so that she would be more comfortable doing various maneuvers. And then her training became more comfortable, faster, and more challenging because she wasn't going to fall behind the other guys. And so from that moment, a full 2 months of her hard training had passed, and she was once again matched up with one of the knights in a confrontation. Their fight didn't last very long, however, and she soon disarmed him, aiming her sword straight for his throat. The man was desperate. He could not understand how he had let the woman defeat him. He was furious that Eva had prevailed in this fight. The girl was very angry at these words, so she swung the tip of her sword across his throat, inflicting a wound. But at that moment, one of the knights said that the fight was over, and Mrs. Eva had won. She immediately put her sword away, and heard the enthusiastic shouts of the other knights, who were intently watching the whole thing. They approached the girl and told her that she had beaten everyone. People even began to respect her for trying very hard to be a better person. And of course, almost all the knights really liked her style of swordsmanship. They found it comfortable and practical. Then the men, talking, realized that Noah was the only knight who could match her, and whom, unfortunately, she could not beat. One of the men said that he saw a future in which the lady would play a large role on the battlefield. Noah, for his part, just watched and did not say a word. He thought about the fact that she had caught the attention of the entire order in an instant, but he didn't understand how it was that she had improved her swordsmanship skills so much in such a short time. The man didn't know if there was any particular reason for this, but he realized that he absolutely had to find out. When Eve stepped aside and sat down on a bench to catch her breath a bit, Noah walked over to her and told her that it was a great job. Her skills were amazing, even to himself. The girl smiled and thanked him for that. She said that there was less than a month left before she would be sent to the battlefield. So she needed to show what she could do. They were silent for a while, just staring at each other. Noah turned to her and asked why she had asked to be sent to the front, since not every knight would want to go there. The girl was a little surprised to hear this question and did not immediately answer. Then the man added that Prime Minister Simon had told him that she was looking for a place to die. Eve looked away from him and said that of course she didn't want to die, much less in that hellish place. Then the man asked how about fleeing the country. But the girl said that of course not, because the empire was her homeland, and she did not intend to leave it ever. For a while Eve pondered whether to speak, but then mustered up the courage to say that she wanted the empire to recognize her services by giving her credit. She asked with a smile on her face, where else would it be possible to do that than on the battlefield? When Noah heard that, he realized what the real reason was. But it surprised him. It was strange for him to even think that such a thing could happen. But in fact, Lady Ava could, in theory, become the Empress. She saw his puzzled face and said that it was not impossible, for there was no law in Lorraine that forbade a woman to inherit the throne, for no one had even guessed that such a thing could ever happen. She said with fire in her eyes that she wanted to change that for sure, seeing a country where men and women could live together on equal rights. Noah smiled and thought about the fact that really a lot of people even forget that. They work for the country, for the people, not just to serve the royal family. And it is important to always remember the values that have shaped them as individuals. Undoubtedly, Lady Ava could not be called the strongest in the empire. But even in such conditions, she thought about the welfare of the state, and this is worthy of praise. Then the man exhaled a sigh of relief, and bowed to the lady and said that he had urgent business to attend to, so he had to go. Soon afterward, Noah returned to the manor and came to the Aaron, apologizing for the disturbance. The guy, when he saw the knight, said that he was going to the city bar for a traditional evening entertainment and offered to go with him, because he would attract girls with his appearance alone. But Noah came closer to him and told Master Aaron that he had a request for him. The man bowed and head down, asked that the man allow him to resign his position as his assistant. When the crown prince heard this, he was very surprised, so much so that he even dropped the mirror from his hands. Shortly after their conversation, the man ran into his sister's room and sharply opened the door and turned to her. The girl was sitting quietly on the sofa reading a book, but Aaron started yelling and said that he was challenging her to a duel for the right to possess Noah. In fact, the man was very surprised that Noah really wanted to serve this slut and not himself, the prince. But Eve had no way of knowing what he was even talking about, so she asked what possession was even in question. She stood up and moved closer to him, asking him what he meant. But Aaron immediately got emotional and started kicking his feet on the floor, telling her to shut up. Noah is actually the most helpful person around him, and it would be incredibly painful for the man to see him go. So he decides to take advantage of the duel and make sure that pesky Eve can never move again. He is going to hit her in a duel at a special point with which she will lose all mobility. And of course no one will even marry her, and Noah will see him in a new light and change his mind. So in this way, Aaron kills 3 birds with 1 stone. But at that moment, Noah came running after the crown prince and asked him to wait for a moment. His watching him try to talk him into it began to guess what was even going on. After a brief silence, the girl asked if she understood correctly that Noah would leave his entourage if she won. Aaron repeated her words, putting great emphasis on the word "if she wins." Then the girl bowed and said that in that case, she would accept the offer. She also said that she accepted such an offer with perfect humility. Then her brother said that the duel would take place 3 days later on the battlefield. He smiled and told her to wait for him there with her head held high and not to be late. Noah looked at Eve in surprise and was about to say something, but he was interrupted. Aaron told him to follow him, for he was still his servant. The 2 of them left the room and went about their business. Eve's only thought was that if she could defeat her brother, Noah would finally have the freedom he deserved. So she was well motivated to win. And so from that moment on, the right amount of time passed, and the duel finally came. All the knights ran straight to the battlefield to watch Master Aru and Eve in their duel. Quite a few guests had gathered, and as Noah stood in the front rows, he turned to Jasper, saying that he hadn't even expected such a fuss about all of this. The guy smiled and asked how he even thought of his brother and sister since they had dueled for him, and that's a great reason to joke about it. But Noah frowned and said that he wanted to say that Master Ara she had enough other good assistants, so he didn't understand what all this was for. His friend slapped him on the back and told him to stop belittling himself already, because he was a worthy candidate too. Soon after, applause was heard, and they looked to the side and saw that Master Aaron had already entered the ring. When all the onlookers saw the crown prince, they noticed that he was all decked out in gear, and thought it was too much and also heavy. Immediately after him, Master Ava entered the ring, who was very elegant in her battle suit. As they came closer together, one of the knights said that they could get ready, and they were announced a moment later to begin the battle. When it first started, Aaron didn't realize how she could act so fast with her sword, and because he was confused, she even pushed him. However, the man was very angry about it, and he didn't want any woman to defeat him. It meant that even simple knights could not overpower him when they were in duels. At this moment, Noah and his assistant were watching, and Jasper asked how good Master Aaron was at swordsmanship. Noah thought about it and said that in fact, no one even wanted to upset the crown prince to not go to the duel. During this time, Eve was trying to gather her thoughts. She supported herself and said that she could do it because he was slow and his armor was too heavy, making it harder for him to make moves. She thought to herself that it would even be easier than turning over a turtle walking on the sand. And at that moment she struck her blow so hard that the man lost his footing and fell. She pointed her sword at him, and then wondered if they would continue, for he sat on the floor and did not move. At this moment, Aaron raised his trembling hand and looked at it, and saw several scratches and blood. His mind immediately went dizzy. He said that she had taken his royal blood. After that, he couldn't take it anymore and fainted, sighing heavily. Then I turned to the other knights and asked for someone to help him. The warriors approached the man and helped him up. Then they began to lead him back to the manor. At this moment Noah came up to her, and the girl, putting his sword away in its case, said that he was now a perfectly free man. The man was still under the impression. He was about to say something to the lady, but suddenly one of the knights came running in and said that the emperor had arrived. When Ava turned around to the side, she was very surprised. She didn't understand what her father was doing in this place, but it was really him and his assistant. She bowed in greeting like the rest of the knights, and really hoped that he had come to make sure of her abilities and not to punish her or anything else. The man stepped closer to her and turned angrily to Eve, saying that she had once again failed to grasp her place where she belonged. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised. She looked up at her father and said that if he meant a duel, it was her brother who had challenged her to a duel. She also said that she felt it was completely wrong that she was being told off for winning this competition. But the man couldn't stand it. He started screaming and asked her to shut up already, because she deserved to die, if only because she had dishonored his heir. He said he didn't understand how she could let this happen, and in front of her subjects, making him look like a fool. At this point, Ava panicked. She realized that she had gone too far. But at that moment her father reached for the rod and said that the lack of discipline should be made up for by physical punishment. He quickly took the tape in his hands, and then he hit the girl in the face. She immediately screamed, because she didn't expect it to happen so quickly and painfully. He swung one more time to teach her a lesson. Noah, who was standing nearby, wanted to ask him to stop because it was wrong to do that, but he didn't have time to say a word, for Jasper came up to him and told him not to do it, for he would regret it later. The emperor, while beating his daughter, suddenly stopped because he saw that his rod had broken into 2 pieces. He sighed heavily and said that he must have put too much effort into it. He started to walk away from the fight, saying she could consider herself still lucky. When the emperor was far enough away to see them, Noah immediately ran to Mrs. Eve, who was lying in the middle of the field and did not even move. Soon he carried her into the bedroom and spoke to Marin. The girl bowed and said that she was already resting. Then Noah inquired if she was tired, but she said she was looking forward to working with him. At that moment Eve heard voices and began to wake up. She saw Noah beside her bed and thanked him softly. It was very painful and unpleasant for the man to see her in such a state, but he said as kindly as he could that the most important thing was that she should get well now, and added that she should sleep to gain strength. She sat down on the bed at this point and said that it's much harder on the battlefield after all, so it's all nothing. Eve was actually feeling unbearably tired at this point, and realized that her father's punishment was far worse than her brother's. Then Noah turned to his mistress and asked if she would allow him to protect her, for he would like to have the right to serve her specifically. When the girl heard this, she panicked. Then she looked at him and asked why he needed to do that, because he was free now. She also said that he wouldn't succeed after all if he served under the command of a worthless princess. Noah was a little surprised to hear these words, but then laughed and replied that since she had wrested his freedom from Mr. Arn, he felt he could choose whom he would serve next. The girl was very surprised to hear this, but at that moment, the man handed her the sword. He sat down on his knee and said he would henceforth be her sword until death freed him from the vow he had made. Eve took the sword in her hands and honestly said that since Noah wanted it that way, she was okay with it. She put the blade on his shoulder. The man kissed the blades and thanked her for it. Then they did the whole ritual as it was supposed to be done, so that he would become her knight. Soon after, the girl went back to bed, and Marin came into the room holding a tray. She said she was very glad to see that Mistress had finally regained her appetite. At that moment, the Emperor's aide walked in and turned to the girl and said that he could see that she had already regained consciousness. The man had some sort of bundle in his hands and informed her that she was going to war and they were moving out tomorrow. When everyone heard this, they were incredibly surprised, but no one could even say anything. Such a shock it was to them. But Ava didn't know what to do in such a situation, for she didn't even know how to ride a horse, and she didn't realize how she would have to go into battle in such a terrible condition. Shortly thereafter, as Prime Minister Simon had promised, they set off. He decided to send her to Sierra, to the far west of the Empire, where rebellion is in full swing, where even professional warriors risk their freedom and their lives on the battlefield. Noah rode with her in the same wagon and told her that Sierra was the land he and Master Aaron had conquered 3 years ago. But it was a country annexed by peaceful negotiations, without military action. He had never even imagined that it could become a disputed territory again. Eva, hearing this, wondered if there had been no fighting over it 3 years ago. The man said that yes, their countries were very different in size, and they had a great advantage in military power over Sierra. Noah also believes that the king made the best decision at that time, in order to avoid any unnecessary sacrifices that might have been made. While they were riding in the carriage, they were also studying some papers that they needed to know. It was at that time that Pierre's kingdom became a dominion, and the lords of Everton began to rule the Sierra. He also has 3 daughters, Lady Floria, Lady Orlais, and most recently, Lady Amelia. Noah said that he admitted defeat to save his people from unnecessary sacrifices, but doesn't understand why it was necessary to rebel now, after such a great amount of time. Eve thought for a moment, then said that they probably wouldn't have rioted without a good reason. The man said that he thought so too, and they were not going to impose their way of life on them. He had not heard of any outrage within the country itself, and judging from the documents the Prime Minister had given them, they did not know why it had happened that way either. Soon they continued riding, but a knight on horseback rode up to their window. He addressed the lady and Noah, saying that they would soon arrive at Fort Escali on the border, and they were very close to Sierra. And so when the girl looked out the window, she saw that indeed it was so. They were already close to the wall. Noah said that when they got there, they would both try to find out the reason for what was happening, and he figured they would have to see for themselves. Some more time passed, and they finally arrived. As soon as they entered Fort Escalina, there they were met by a man on the threshold and told that women were not allowed in the place. Eve was very surprised, but she said he was Captain Grayson after all. And she's in this place by order of the Emperor himself. She said that as captain, he must have been informed of her visit, but the man only smiled and waved his hands, asking what would happen if he knew nothing about it. He unfolded the piece of paper he held in his hand, and said that the letter that had come to him said that he was to do whatever he wanted with Eve and her entourage. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised and said in a low voice that it was absurd after all. She didn't understand how on earth he could meddle in their affairs, and thought about how her brother was probably determined, as always, to mess things up for her even here. She was so engrossed in thinking that she didn't even see the bow and arrow drawn from above, aiming straight at her. Noah, who was just in time to notice it, pulled the girl back and immediately drew his sword to defend himself. He managed to fend off the arrow so it didn't hit anyone. Then the voice of other knights was heard from above, shouting that they didn't need women on the battlefield and asking that Eve leave. Many cried out that she should go to their kitchen, for that was the only thing she was capable of doing. Others told her to leave her luggage behind, for they might need it. Noah was incredibly angry when he heard all this. He was ready to attack them, but Eve stopped him and told him not to. They were not such a threat. Noah is actually the most wanted and respected man in the place. But when he's with her, things go completely differently than she imagined. The guard who was guarding the gate told the man that he was a fool to go and get into trouble, And after all he had done for him, it was very foolish. The man said that this was the message Master Aaron had asked Master Aaron to give them. He then slammed the door shut so they were no longer in sight and said that he had passed it on. So that was the end of it. They could leave.